Last year for Halloween, I discussed Halloween and how the first movie in that series was perhaps the definitive slasher. A baseline template for the genre that played into suspense more than its successors would, but that beat the path that the genre would eventually take. Even in that scenario, though, Halloween was walking a path that another had traveled before. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre series, born from a plucky little indie film from the mid-70s. Texas Chainsaw has never been as traditional as its successor would be. The series largely ignores most typical filmmaking structure in favor of an almost hell-bent desire to be weird, at least when it started, although time has not been kind to the evolution of Texas Chainsaw, as it slips more and more into following the path that initially Blunt forced its way into creating. If nothing else, it's hard to say that from its conception, it wasn't one of the strangest franchises to ever hit the big screen, and that makes it interesting to explore as it slowly continues to fall from grace. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre is one of the most bizarre films of its time, near avant-garde and bordering on art house. The movie immediately begins with a flagrant lie, that it's based on a true story. It takes notes from Ed Gein, namely in that the family decorates their home with human remains, but largely it was a new and fascinating tactic, an immediate sense of raw authenticity that the movie thrives on. Texas Chainsaw isn't fun, it's not even really gory. It's weird, swift, and uncomfortable. In a movie like Friday the 13th, death is a spectacle. Characters are killed in increasingly brutal and bizarre ways, gore is everywhere, and the joy is in watching it happen. In Texas Chainsaw, people die. Characters are smashed in the head with a hammer, crumple over nearly bloodlessly, and cease to be in the movie. It's this that makes Texas Chainsaw special. No glitz or glamour, Texas Chainsaw feels like a documentary. A handful of people end up somewhere they shouldn't be. They're snuffed out in seconds, and the movie agonizingly crawls along without narrative or much dialogue. In a sense, it's kind of an anti-movie. Whilst to some extent it establishes the final girl trope of the genre as the lone survivor makes a narrow escape from Leatherface, there's no heroic speech, no confrontation. It's a miserable grind as she gets beaten, thrown around, and tortured for reasons she can't understand. And honestly, it's made fairly clear that Leatherface doesn't either. He may be a hulking monster wearing the face of a man, in a very literal sense, but he's got the effective intelligence of a toddler, a creature acting on some sort of raw urge to consume. Even Jason Voorhees is driven by something, for as shallow as he is, a sort of innate urge for revenge, where Leatherface is almost inscrutable, pure instinct, raw, brutal. This realness is what creates the tension and fear that makes this movie. Life is chaotic, violent, weird, and inexplicable. People are fragile, weak, and afraid in comparison to the unknowable. The movie doesn't even need to rely on cheap gore or scares. It's, even for 1974, pretty paltry budget of $140,000, which is about $900K today, ends up being an unintentional strength. When combined with the strange atmosphere, decrepit setting, and sheer misery, all these things together carry it more than showing the violence explicitly ever could. The last 30 minutes especially go to another dimension. The dinner scene is the last with dialogue, more or less. Leatherface's family are an assortment of oddballs, and the movie veers into the territory of being a dark comedy for a bit. Leatherface himself arrives in makeup, he's the woman of the house, an under-acknowledged provider for the family, in the bizarre sense that his blunt power provides the cannibals with their food. The cook openly admits his distaste for murder. He doesn't have the stomach for it despite his stomach for eating people, and gets upset at Leatherface's property damage while acquiring ingredients. The hitchhiker spends most of his time abusing Leatherface. He's a pathetic squirrel of a man whose only power over Leatherface is being someone off limits for him to kill, where Leatherface's brute force won't work. And lastly, Grandpa, who first appears sitting limp in a chair next to a corpse, seemingly dead himself, but at the dinner is revealed to be alive but very nearly comatose. Despite his silence and near immobility, the family looks to him for guidance, and even give him a chance to relive his glory days by killing the final girl Sarah himself, although he's so feeble that there's an agonizing several-minute scene of him repeatedly dropping the hammer he's been given to do so on the ground, over and over and over. It's brilliantly unhinged, uncomfortable, and hilarious, and leads into 20 straight minutes of screaming disorientation and fear, and at the end, there's no real satisfaction. Sarah escapes, screaming, laughing, completely broken. Leatherface swings his saw in frustration against the rising sun, and nothing changes. The movie ends without a clear resolution, without an ending at all, really. Without a doubt, Leatherface and his family will continue to do their thing, mostly unimpeded. They exist in rural Texas, nobody's looking for them, and nobody cares. And perhaps the one person who does is too broken to do anything about it. It's brilliantly, masterfully bleak and unsatisfying, because just like people sometimes just die quickly and horribly in real life, sometimes you just don't get to know how a story ends. Sometimes that story, that cycle, continues in a margin of space where nobody knows where to look. Sometimes there's nobody to tell the rest of that story, and very often, reality isn't satisfying. That's what makes Texas Chainsaw feel real.
On the afternoon of August 18th, 1973, 5 young people in a Volkswagen van ran out of gas on a farm road in South Texas. 4 of them were never seen again. The next morning, the one survivor, Sally Hardesty Enright, was picked up on a roadside, blood-caked and screaming murder. Sally said she had broken out of a window in hell. The girl babbled a mad tale. A cannibal family in an isolated farmhouse, chainsawed fingers and bones. Her brother, her friends, hacked up for barbecue. Chairs made of human skeletons. Then she sank into catatonia. Texas lawmen mounted a month-long manhunt, but could not locate the macabre farmhouse. They could find no killers and no victims, no facts, no crime. Officially, on the records, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre never happened. But during the last 13 years, over and over again, reports of bizarre, grisly chainsaw mass murders have persisted all across the state of Texas. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre has not stopped. It haunts Texas. It seems to have no end.
But of course, sometimes if you're lucky, things don't end there. And when that story comes back into focus, it's often unrecognizable. A new form taken for reasons as mysterious as they ended. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre Part 2 is the anti-Texas Chainsaw Massacre. And given that was a bit of an anti-movie itself, you end up in a weird place. Canon Pictures, its own huge rabbit hole for another time, somehow ended up producing the sequel as part of a 3-film deal with original director Tobe Hooper, and they were presumably quite excited to receive the massive sequel to one of horror's biggest hits. But when Part 2 finally launched in 1986, 12 years after the original, it was a self-parodic screwball comedy. Flagrantly so, with posters parodying The Breakfast Club, over-the-top gore and effects by the legendary Tom Savini, wackier family members, and it's also a bit of a romantic comedy. Perhaps we should back up some. The film centers itself on a DJ, Stretch, who inadvertently ends up on the air on the phone with someone who Leatherface kills, and because of this, gets in contact with Lieutenant Lefty, Sally's uncle, who has spent his days hunting down the people who attacked his niece and feels vindicated in his hunt by hearing this. The two largely go their own way from here, but cross over in the big finale. Stretch ends up meeting the cook as he wins her radio station's big chili cook-off with some prime meat, and this spirals into her meeting the wackiest new family member, Chop Top, the best character in the series.
Me and Bubba, my little brother, we listen to you every night. Music is my life. You know, you're my fave, but I get too embarrassed to phone in my request. It's too disembodied, you know. But now that we're here in flesh and blood, I could maybe make a request and it'd still count, huh?
Well, just as psychotic as the others, maybe even more so, he's also something of a neurotic hippie, constantly picking at his own skin to eat it, constantly laid back but going off on odd tangents. He's both captivatingly funny and intimidating, and this all spirals into Leatherface developing a crush on Stretch and taking her back to the family's abandoned amusement park lair to meet the family, including the corpse of the hitchhiker being puppeteered around on strings after he died in the previous movie. Meanwhile, Lefty goes to get chainsaws of his own,
Well, don't you want to test them? There's gas in them.
Which culminates in a frankly insane climax where he fights Leatherface with dual-wielded chainsaws. It's hard to describe how funny a movie is beyond saying I laughed, but the movie just plays with a lot of funny scenarios that are just contrasted with the minimalism of the prior movie. Seeing Leatherface go from this roaring mountain to a lovesick child is funny, the hitchhiker gag is funny, Lefty is funny. This movie feels like the most overproduced, insane, stupidest version of what the original could have been if it had a Titanic budget and it completely works. What it lacks in tension or horror, it makes up for by just rolling with it and having a good time. Made even funnier by being an effective self-parody from the original director. It's kind of hard to talk about because it's so caught up in gags and spectacle, but I quite love the insanity and think it's easily the most fun movie in the franchise.
On August 18, 1973, Sally Hardesty, her invalid brother Franklin, and their friends fell afoul of a bizarre cannibalistic plan of serial predators. Miss Hardesty was the sole survivor of that night of terror. She died in a private healthcare facility in 1977. A single member of the murderous family lived to see trial. The prosecution recorded his name as W.E. Sawyer. He died in a gas chamber in 1981. The jurors concluded that Leatherface, presumed to be an unapprehended killer, was in fact an alternate personality of Sawyer's, activated whenever he donned a crude mask made of human flesh. If there was no Leatherface in reality, then Sally Hardesty may at last rest in peace. If there actually was a Leatherface, he remains at large, and the so-called Texas Chainsaw Massacre was only the beginning.
And then we come to a bit of a black sheep in the series. New Line Cinema was created, essentially, by Nightmare on Elm Street, and with its success, they kind of spun into their own little horror production house and ended up buying Texas Chainsaw off of Canon. However, they weren't interested in experimenting like the first two had done, instead wanting to play it pretty safe. Focus on Leatherface over the family and make it more of a real movie, which kind of misses the point of the first two. A trailer was whipped up before the movie even had a director, and things didn't really improve from there. The movie was handed off to Jeff Burr, a horror sequel master so to say, and production went so badly he was fired. Nobody else wanted to deal with it, so he was rehired, and on and on and on. Finally, in 1990, Leatherface, The Texas Chainsaw Massacre 3, taking a page out of Rambo's book of horrible titles I see, would release to a mixed reception. To say the finished result is horrible would be harsh. It's a perfectly okay slasher movie with some fun effects work, decent shooting, passable performances from the villains, at least, but a lot of meh shit. Much of the movie is 2-0 characters being chased around in the woods by the new tow truck driver character, who is very, very boring. It picks up a bit when the main family is introduced. The little girl is an interesting idea, even if she's not used much, and Grandpa being dead and mummified is the closest the movie gets to being funny, although ending in a shootout is very, very lame for this franchise. Chainsaw 3 had a hard path to follow. The first is a bizarre cinema verite masterpiece, and the second is a hilarious comedy, and the third is generic slasher fodder, more in line with Friday the 13th than its predecessors. It's fine enough as a mindless background thing in spooky season, but it's not very exciting. Very middle-of-the-road, safe movie, walking in the footsteps of two bizarre and interesting predecessors.
August 18th, 1973. News of a bizarre chainsaw-wielding family. Reports which were to ignite the world's imagination began to filter out of central Texas. Regrettably, not one of the family members was ever apprehended, and for more than 10 years, nothing further was heard. Then, over the next several years, at least 2 minor yet apparently related incidents were reported. Then again, nothing. For 5 long years, silence.
Of the many things you could call it, including, but probably not limited to, the return of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Texas Chainsaw Massacre The Next Generation, and simply Texas Chainsaw Massacre 4, you can't call it boring or safe. Kim Henkel took the reins, returning after having co-written the original movie, and he puts on a bizarre show closer to the second movie than it is any of the others, although the intentionality is more muddy. I wouldn't call it a masterpiece, but I do think people at the time didn't really get it. It was hated when it initially released, as was the Texas Chainsaw Massacre Part 2. TriStar got their hands on it, re-edited it, and people still didn't like it. To be fair, it's very left field even comparatively. This movie is most notable for its two then-unknown stars, Matthew McConaughey and Renee Zellweger, who would go on to be megastars around the time this shitshow of a movie finally came out, through Dazed and Confused and Jerry Maguire respectively, with lawsuits alleging that Matthew McConaughey did his best to have the movie buried because coming off of being a megastar, it looks pretty questionable. To his credit, McConaughey hard carries this movie.
You don't know? No. Shit, do you? No. Do you think all I want to do is kill you?
I don't know.
You goddamn right you don't.
Why don't you just try to relax a bit, honey? I know it's hard.
Why don't you mind your fucking business?
His intensity is perfect, and he plays a ridiculous character very straight. Saddled with robotic leg braces he controls via TV remotes. Yes, there is a scene where he has the remote stolen. Yes, there is a scene where he has the remotes mixed up. Yes, it's hilarious, because it's played so straight. There's also some good chemistry with the rest of the family. McConaughey comes off perfectly as this intense and frightening man who can bend anyone to him, convincing others he's behind JFK's assassination, among other bizarre claims, and he really works. Leatherface is a little sidelined. They play up the cross-dressing thing a little, but don't do all that much with it. Perhaps my favorite scene in the movie is when Grandfather, who is seemingly dead, as was the case in the previous movie, stands up and walks out of the movie. It's such a bizarre sight gag that tips the movie's hand as a sometimes too subtle parody of the prior movies. Although there are some elements that may be a bit too bizarre, like the Illuminati subplot with Rothman, a character who apparently set Vilmer, McConaughey's character, and Leatherface loose on the world to give people the transcendence only pure horror can achieve, which kinda loses me even if I do find the reveal of this extremely formal man in a suit bossing Leatherface around before revealing his bizarre sacrifications. It's all very interesting, although I don't know where it's supposed to be scary and where it's supposed to be funny. The movie can definitely be read as somewhat meta, with Rothman being some guiding light to horror perfection, while the family and Leatherface are these intense but ultimately ineffectual goobers who mull around in a stinky shack eating pizza while failing to kill a dumb teenage girl who constantly one-ups them. It's also not a movie without problems. As much as I find it funny and interesting, our protagonists are really stinky basic archetypes, even for being parodies of generic horror protagonists. It gets a little old, and the first half drags a bit, kind of plodding along, but despite that I think something this bizarre is worth a shot. Written off largely for not being scary and for being very weird and convoluted, this movie has unfortunately been kind of buried by the opinions of people who didn't get the joke. It's interesting, weird, and fits in well with the first two, if not exactly reaching their highs. I suppose I should drive by All-American Massacre, the most bizarre fan film ever shot, by Tobe Hooper's son, Tony Hooper. While it was shot, it never released, and has been kind of a big deal for Texas Chainsaw fans, or Leatherhead. Damn it, that's taken. What was I saying? All-American Massacre is a lost prequel to Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2, serving as an origin story for who else but Chop Top. Unfortunately, outside of about a minute of trailer, not much has been released. The film hit immediate legal road bumps for use of Texas Chainsaw characters, whose legal rights are in an increasingly complex situation, as it's already been passed around 3 times in 4 movies. Not to mention the funding issues that come with something of this nature. At one point, a Kickstarter was created to finish the funding for post-production, like 20 years after the fact, but it was a situation where there weren't enough Leatherhead. Gotta stop saying that. To actually hit the goal, and thus the movie remains a fascinating enigma, hiding in plain sight.
The events of that day were to lead to one of the most bizarre crimes in the annals of American history. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre.
Then things go backwards again, as they tend to do. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, not confusing at all, is a remake of the original movie produced by Michael Bay's Platinum Dunes, the first of the production company's efforts in 2003, and it would spur a slew of horror remakes over the next 5-ish years, including Platinum Dunes' own Amityville Horror, Friday the 13th, and Nightmare on Elm Street movies, not to mention the ones made by other studios, such as House of Wax and The Grudge and Ring. It's crazy that this movie ended up having a legacy not too dissimilar from the movie it's remaking, although it's certainly not a high watermark of the slasher horror genres. This movie's problem, ultimately, is being too much of a movie, kinda like Chainsaw 3. It has good production design, it's competently made, and the kills and scares are actually pretty good because they capture some of the raw brutality of the original. Hell, the sheriff is actually kinda funny with his over-the-top happy-go-lucky thing.
What are you gonna do? Shoot me?
Morgan, please, just please put the gun down, okay? Please don't kill me. Oh my God, Morgan.
You lying fuck! You could kill me right now. Get out of here scot-free, couldn't you?
Morgan, please, just please put it down.
He shoots me! You're accomplice to murder!
Morgan, please.
You too?
Please, come on.
Just as guilty as him.
Morgan! Yeah! Fucking shoot him! You put the gun down. Morgan, shoot him! Don't fucking do it, please!
You don't have the fucking balls, do you?
Don't shoot him, Morgan! Shoot him!
Pull the fucking trigger! Fuck you!
But the impact and randomness and tension and confusion are boiled away by having extremely sexy and beautiful movie star woman Jessica Biel strutting in every scene, obviously the protagonist, and kicking ass and fighting back while elaborate music stings highlight all the big moments. She doesn't get dirty and piss herself and get beat up and scream and cry. She's just the hero of the story through and through, down to fighting off Leatherface and rescuing an innocent baby. Speaking of, how come in all the promotional materials for this movie she was photographed braless? She's clearly wearing one in the movie. Is this what the kids call deceptive marketing? She mostly just gets a lot of egregious ass shots in the movie. There's times where this movie really nails an idea. The hitchhiker killing herself in the van at the start is a super intense and unexpected intro. Leatherface living in the walls, the bumbling redneck sheriff suddenly shifting into a shockingly intense manipulator, how disgusting and slimy and bloody Leatherface's lair especially is, plus him wearing Jessica Biel's boyfriend's face is this really bizarrely funny and uncomfortable moment, and the little found footage intro and outro are pretty neat as well. And these things are enough to carry the movie into being serviceable. Even beyond it being too much of a movie, it has other issues though, mostly ones that are a part of all these Platinum Dunes horror remakes. The gray and blue color grading has made the visuals age like hot milk, it resolves far too cleanly, and in the same way 3 could be, it feels too much like a retread, where its interesting new ideas are minor beats wrapped in what is largely a pretty generic version of the original story. It's another serviceable watch, like 3, but sort of falls in another middling category, a bit above 3 for production value alone, but very, very similar in a lot of ways. Now where do you take the series from here? Back even further, of course, with a backstory prequel directed by Jonathan Liebsman, director of hits like Battle Los Angeles, Wrath of the Titans 2012, Michael Bay Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, and Robert Downey Jr. Doolittle reshoots. Texas Chainsaw Massacre: The Beginning, a ridiculous mouthful of a title, released to far less success and fanfare than its predecessor, so let's see where it all went wrong. The Beginning is the worst of the worst when it comes to lore movies, answering every asinine thing that someone could have been curious about, and even worse, filling in gaps that nobody was struggling to infer. It's not always stupid because the answers are obvious, though. Sometimes it's stupid because the answers are stupid. Why are the family cannibals? Because, the sheriff was a prisoner of war in Japan and the Japanese didn't feed them, so he ate a guy. How did he lose his teeth? One character bashed his head into the ground in this movie. How did the wheelchair guy lose his legs? And on it goes. There's no idea, no message, no creativity. The movie is a boring checklist of explaining minor details without ever attempting to swing at a broader question, like the psychology of Leatherface or something like that. Instead, going for the low-hanging fruit of Leatherface is mad he got laid off at the butchering factory and that's why his family is poor. Something that you could kind of just plainly infer from, watching it. The movie also pisses away time with poorly acted filler, as outside of the sheriff, who himself is a bit mischaracterized by skipping out on his more pleasant facade, nobody is trying that hard in this movie. Combine that with rote scenes of, I'm burning my draft card because I don't want to go to Vietnam, and Vietnam gave me PTSD, and we pissed off the 1970s biker gang with shotguns, and you end up with a meandering, dull, slow movie that doesn't have any impact, especially when chainsaw kills have themselves become pretty predictable and dry at this point in the series. It's a truly embarrassing affair, one so bad it would end up kicking Platinum Dunes off of Chainsaw, which would lead to another inevitable shakeup. The Beginning is far and away the least interesting movie in the franchise and absolutely not worth watching. It's ugly, it's a slog, and it's hard to find any appeal. It would be 7 years before Chainsaw would bounce back from The Beginning. Between shifting hands again and the typical production issues of the franchise, it wouldn't be until 2013 that Texas Chainsaw 3D would come out. Yeah, I know that 3D is a lot to unpack. Avatar did a real number on movies at this time. A joint venture between Lionsgate and Twisted Pictures, the group behind Saw, the plans for Texas Chainsaw 3D were pretty ambitious. James Wan was originally slated to direct it, and oh my god, I so fucking wish he did. And a trilogy was planned, but eventually the movie was kicked down the road to some nobody and came out to another muted reception. I actually saw this one in theaters, and I didn't remember a lot about it going in. Like no horror franchise can resist, this is also the beginning of Texas Chainsaw's timeline confusion. This movie is a direct sequel to the original movie, even though it seemingly takes place in 2010-ish, but the protagonist was a baby during the first movie as seen in the opening scenes. Meanwhile, it ignores movies 2 through 4 and leaves the remakes to their own thing. If the protagonist was a baby at the start of the first one, she'd be like 40 instead of 20, but, you know, here we are. To be fair, if you're trying to make a real movie that scares teenagers who want to get blowjobs in the theater, you'd have a hard time including and reconciling the manic insanity of 2 and 4 specifically. Timeline confusion isn't the only thing this movie apes from Halloween, as it steals the most brain-damaged premise imaginable from that series. Our protagonist was rescued by a bunch of rednecks as a baby after Leatherface's arrest, and is Leatherface's cousin. When she realizes she's adopted, her parents don't say, "Look, don't go down there, your real family were serial-killing cannibals." They say, "Sweaty, you might not like what you find," and then she storms off because they didn't explain anything to her, and she doesn't know why they don't want her to go there. And it's because they were murdering cannibals. When she arrives to Texas, she discovers she now owns a giant mansion that Grandma Sawyer left her, that somehow rose from the dilapidated shack of the prior movie, and that Leatherface has been locked in the basement for years, and a hitchhiker the group picked up lets him out while casing the place. And speaking of even more shit ripped from Halloween, this movie also has the classic black musician appears in long-running horror franchise for some reason trope, as much like Halloween Resurrection had Busta Rhymes, this movie features Trey Songz. He's bad. Anyway, it's not that important, it's just kind of weird that it happened twice. If the original movie serves as a time capsule of the 70s, and the remake serves as a time capsule to how ugly movies were in 2003, this movie serves as an extremely embarrassing reminder of the worst parts of human history, 2010. Especially when those horrible made-for-3D shots crop up, and with how brutally clean the ultra-saturation added in post makes everything, primarily because of the 3D, there's none of that disgusting raw grime and blood and dirt. Even the woods that get chased through are lively and green, oversaturated and pretty, and the blood and gore is pretty minimal, surprisingly. Moving location to a fancy mansion doesn't really help either, removing any trace of the grimy backwoods thing the franchise had going in favor of being a generic slasher set in a mansion. There are a few things this movie does that are at least a little bit interesting. For one, they make Leatherface an anti-hero, which is a horrendous idea. Just horrible idea. He's out for revenge against the town that wrongfully killed his family. Big quotation marks around the word wrongfully, because they were all murderers. But you know, his main motivation throughout the movie is to rescue his cousin. By interesting, I mean fucking stupid. But, you know, Saw X managed to pull off the whole villain becomes the anti-hero thing. This movie pretty much doesn't. It's hard to feel sympathetic for Leatherface because he's a mindless screeching monster. The protagonist throwing him a chainsaw and saying, "Do your thing, cuz," so he can slaughter corrupt police officers.
Do your thing, cuz.
Is the most mind-boggling climax I think you could possibly come up with for a Texas Chainsaw movie. It kind of still stuns me if my narration is falling apart a little bit. I've complained a lot, but is there anything to like in this movie? It's only 90 minutes. Alexandra Daddario is really, really distractingly hot. Scott Eastwood has frosted tips, which is really funny. And the bald cop who's really excited to try out his new gun is a funny side character.
Sheriff, no disrespect, but I think I need to move on this.
That's not your call, officer. Marvin, this is Mayor Harvin. You got your eagle?
You know what extended clip. Just looking for a reason, sir.
Then what the hell are you waiting for?
I was constantly laughing. I literally burst out laughing when Leatherface realizes the protagonist is his cousin because he sees her Sawyer titty tattoo that she got when she was a baby, I guess. That's not a compliment, but it's funny. The thing is, like, the long and short of Texas Chainsaw 3D is that it's completely just the stupidest thing ever made. It's ugly in all the stupid ways instead of the cool ways. It's quite possibly the stupidest premise a movie could have, a Texas Chainsaw movie could have, on like 8 or 9 levels. Like, pretty much every premise this movie puts forward is bad. But, like, despite that, despite how horribly bizarre and stupid everything in this movie is, look how much I had to say about it. It's horribly made. Very, very horribly made. But I was amused throughout at all the bizarre antics that this movie managed to conjure up with its horrible premises. It's a hilariously incompetent movie that keeps you hooked, that's constantly entertaining, that always catches you off guard, makes you laugh. I don't think it's intentional like 2 and 4 are, but it is very funny and entertaining schlock to spend 90 minutes on, I'll say that. Well, a sequel to Chainsaw 3D was pitched, bizarrely, to be called Texas Chainsaw 4, which doesn't make sense on literally any level. For one, there was already a Texas Chainsaw 4, The Return of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and 3D is the second movie in its alternate continuity. So calling it Texas Chainsaw 4 doesn't make sense unless they're taking the 3D literally as a 3, like in Friday the 13th. But there's only 2 movies in that continuity, so I'm not sure why that one would be 3. But regardless of all that, the movie would eventually fall through in favor of a prequel. While originally meant to release in 2016, the film would stumble out as a direct-to-direct TV film, yeah really, and its delay in releasing would end up costing Lionsgate the rights to the franchise, once again. Leatherface exists to fill in more gaps that didn't need filling, although to its credit, its contrived prequel status is at least a little less embarrassing, as it chooses to go back to Leatherface's teenage years instead of to some random thing that happened 2 years ago to explain minor plot details. However, the story we get is still questionable. The movie starts with a police raid, because the Sawyer family are, serial killers, and this leads to baby Leatherface going into custody. He's shown not to have quite the heart for killing his family does, although he ends up killing several people in self-defense throughout the movie. And while not the smartest, it's really not until the end of the movie that he becomes a screeching monster man after he gets horribly injured by one of the corrupt police officers. It's an odd angle to take. In the original movie, it's sort of implied he's just the endpoint of some backwoods incest program. And even in this movie, there's kind of a wishy-washiness around it all because he still kind of starts mentally handicapped anyway in this one. The primary antagonists of the movie are a group of corrupt cops, as the movie puts it, at least corrupt in the sense that they bother the Sawyers because they're murderers and they chase down escaped mental patients who are killing people, including baby Leatherface. The perspective of the movie is all kinds of weird, clinging to a kindly nurse who attempts to help, but also framing Leatherface as some kind of bizarre victim of circumstance who only kills people who deserve it, up until the end when he kills the kindly nurse. Leatherface's big problem is kind of being a nothing movie. I don't really care how Leatherface ended up as a screaming murderer. The original movie said enough about that situation. Much of the movie is just 5 people wandering around the woods, and I think the police are more or less reasonable in this story. Leatherface and the huge guy you're supposed to believe is Leatherface for most of the movie get shot because they're murderers. It has little interesting to say, being an origin for something you could reasonably intuit without much work, and on top of that, it's kind of just boring and ugly, with a horrible orange filter over most day scenes, flatly shot, and a horrible blue day-to-night effect when the sun goes down. It's certainly not as bad as the beginning was. It at least has some idea it attempts to make work. It just doesn't need to exist either, and doesn't have exciting or interesting ideas. It's not the watchable Fluff 3 is either, as it's rather tame and dry. It's not very interesting to talk about at all, simply because so little goes on in it. Finally, we sputtered to some kind of end, not with a bang, but with a whimpering Netflix original, Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Dropping the word "the" from the title doesn't make its naming any less confusing, it perhaps makes it even worse. Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2022 decides to ignore the 3-film continuity that Texas Chainsaw 3D established. It instead roundabouts into being a sequel to Texas Chainsaw The Return, which, well based, is itself a bit confusing and irrelevant since it kind of directly contradicts 2, 3, and 4 ever happening in this movie, so you'd think it'd just be its own thing, but they officially said 2, 3, and 4 also happen? I don't get it. Unlike most of the other movies, the production here isn't that interesting. Lionsgate's rights to the franchise lapsed because of Leatherface's delays, and Legendary stepped in to keep this franchise dragging along. David Blue Garcia directs. You may know him from, nothing, but the film is notably a legacy sequel like Star Wars, or perhaps more relevantly, Blumhouse's Halloween revival, featuring an elderly Leatherface contending with an elderly Sally from the first movie, although recast as Marilyn Burns passed away years before this movie began production, thankfully for her. Probably a bad note to start a legacy sequel on. Perhaps the worst note to start on is that this movie was filmed with the idea to put it in theaters, but test screenings went so badly it ended up as a Netflix original movie. This is going to be very painful. This movie is a solid contender for most embarrassing movie I've ever seen, and I would like to apologize to Texas Chainsaw at the beginning for calling it the worst one because, that was a lie. Everything about this movie made me grimace like an old man yelling at clouds. A group of TikTok Zoomers arrive in an abandoned mid-century town and announce, "This is late-stage capitalism at its finest," which frankly doesn't make sense at all in this context, even slightly. They then attempt to open a restaurant by evicting an elderly Leatherface from his home. In the midst of their influencer and investor meeting, Leatherface starts cutting people up. At one point he breaks into their tour bus and everyone pulls out their phones and starts filming him. One guy proudly announces that he's canceling Leatherface and begins streaming him on TikTok. It feels like an SNL sketch. It literally feels like an SNL sketch. I feel like Skeet Davidson is gonna step out and force me to gaze into his cavernous butthole eyes, say, "Welcome to the weekend update. Today, mass serial killer Leatherface gets canceled. Also, we have special guest Don Cheadle on." I was checked out before this, but I could really feel the growth of brain damage just fermenting inside my skull as I watched at this point. Texas Chainsaw had dark humor as a constant among its early movies, sure, but that largely came in the form of wacky side characters in the family who are absent here in favor of straight comedy bits that don't work. It all just becomes more confusing when Sally shows up, now a sad granny to match sad grandpa Leatherface. She's now a Texas Ranger for some reason, even though she didn't live in Texas. She was just passing through on a road trip, and she was just some hippie. And I guess, like, the Leatherface incident, for some reason, made her a badass cop for some reason. But she, like, gets BTFO'd by Leatherface in, like, 4 seconds anyway. After she rescues the Zoomer, she gives a dramatic speech meant to rip off Jamie Lee Curtis's from the Halloween revival, while making very obvious and pointed references to being a legacy character in case you didn't get it, like the part where she longingly stares at a photograph of all her friends from the first movie while children's laughter plays over it for some reason, at which point she goes to fight Leatherface, because, and I quote, "He never stops chasing you. It's been 45 years and he hasn't bothered you once. He was living in the middle of nowhere, not bothering anyone. No one knew he was there. He was retired. He was in retirement. You came and tracked him down." And there was 3 movies between the first one where he could have went and found you if he wanted. And he didn't. He did not. He simply did not care. It's a nonsense sentence. You could have just driven away and left him to be. She also calls herself the only survivor of Leatherface, yet this movie's allegedly canon to 2, 3, and 4, and there's several people who escaped alive in those movies. Did Netflix just forget to Google what happens in Texas Chainsaw 2? The movie's biggest problem is a lack of tension and excitement, or really any ability to hold interest. The characters are obnoxious, and I don't care if they die, and Sally coming back, recast, is embarrassing, as she wasn't much of a character. She was a screaming, terrified, bloody plot device. The kills are flat and dull, not in the brutal and uncanny way they were in the original, but in the generic CGI gore kind of way, where it's just a silent monster whacking people with a chainsaw without the personality of the family to balance it. There's no real build-up, we don't get to see any escalation at all. Leatherface's house is a beat-up apartment, but it isn't covered in human furniture and bones, and we don't have an agonizing beginning as stuff starts to snowball into a nightmare. Leatherface shows up 10 minutes in, the audience claps because they recognize him, and minutes later he's killing Zoomers. It's also it feels exactly like the Netflix original it is. Cheap, sloppy, disposable content thrown into the wind to make some numbers go up on a board at the Netflix HQ. Does this movie have literally anything going for it? It's an almost laughable 75 minutes, which makes it a little less painful to slog through, and means it isn't dragged out, thankfully. But for something that's less of a backhand compliment, some of the cinematography and production design stuff is okay. Mostly when it comes to like landscape shots or shots of the town, like the shot of Leatherface walking through the sunflower fields. You know, the action is boring, so the cinematographer was sleeping through the action, but he can make a landscape look good. It's not difficult in the way that the beginning was with all its disgusting bloom and filters, which is something, I suppose. I hate to end on a sour note, but this movie is painful, truly and endlessly embarrassing. One of the most pathetic attempts ever made to join in on the already pathetic legacy sequel trend. Tensionless, dull, and lifeless. 75 minutes of Leatherface walking through the dried sunflower fields probably would have worked better than what we got. Texas Chainsaw has been a ride. I'm surprised how much I've enjoyed, in a variety of ways, so many of these movies. The franchise is never afraid to take risks and go odd places, bouncing between brutal and realistic proto-art house to wacky comedy, to whatever the hell 4 is, to whatever the hell 3D is. The franchise is always cutting its own path in some way, in ways that it landed perfectly and in ways that fell flat, but often being entertaining even when it did. Hell, even the remake, which I derided as a bit too much of a movie, was a forerunner for an entire decade of horror remakes, as its predecessors had been for slashers in general. Its lowest points are when it follows what others had done, Whether that was 3 being a real movie, Leatherface being an origin story, or 2022 hopping on the legacy sequel trend in the most embarrassing ways possible. When I picked this franchise, I expected a pretty smooth ride that would make for a quick Halloween video, a great movie, a couple weird ones, then a slow slide into mediocrity, but I've been pleasantly surprised with how much these movies refuse to meet my expectations, which may be the greatest strength of this franchise. A horror movie with almost no dramatics, a comedy spin on the prior movie, the schizophrenic rantings of its original writer, the anti-hero twists of its soft reboot. You never quite know what you're gonna get, and while that doesn't always end up with the results you'd consider traditionally, good, undeniably it usually ends up being interesting. The last few years have been rough for the franchise, a sort of gasping decline, too scared to take risks or break the algorithms and formulas that determine what people should like, too scared to let loose and have fun, to be wacky. These movies need an energy the boardroom can't stumble into, an odd, manic energy that drives this franchise to its most interesting highs and lows. I can only hope that in some way this franchise eventually stumbles back into the hands of someone insane, weird, and perhaps, as in 3D, incompetent enough to do justice to the incredible original. Whatever the case may be, I had fun looking back at this franchise, and I'll catch you next Halloween for another horror franchise to burrow into.